Hey guys, I'm Jeremy, and I figured today I'd tell you about my experience living in Taiwan. I lived there for 3 years. The first year I taught, the second 2 years I did a graduate degree in basically like Taiwan and China studies. It's a super underrated island. A lot of people probably just assume it's like a big manufacturing hub, which it is in a lot of ways, but it's super beautiful. You've got peaks up to 13,000 feet, amazing beaches. You've got a lot of the original like Chinese culture, which wasn't ruined by communism. Super nice people, and they've got great options if you want to study like Chinese or master's or a PhD or even a bachelor's. They're really good with scholarships. I'll mention that a little bit later. I also have lived in mainland China for 10 years, so in this video I'll compare my experiences about both of them and which ones I'd recommend. Overall, I would say Taiwan's a little better, but it does have some shortfalls as far as employment and things like that. And I'll also go into some of the tourist areas and the places that are cool, and in general the pros and cons of Taiwan. So before I lived in Taiwan in 2010, I lived in mainland China from 2006 to 2007. I was in a place called Kunming, China. I was actually on a bike trip around the world. I got ran over by an SUV near Tibet, and I needed to get surgery in Kunming. So after I got out of the hospital, I got a job, and I ended up living there for a year and a half. And Kunming was a great experience. It's super cool. It was undeveloped. It was really the Wild West China. A lot of people even considered it being kind of more like Southeast Asia because it's so far southwest China and next to like Thailand and Cambodia, Laos and Vietnam that it had quite a different vibe. There's also 27 different ethnic groups there, so it was quite an interesting thing, but it was undeveloped. And I did like the experience of living in China, but I wanted to go somewhere more developed, maybe like Guangzhou or something like that. And my friend had lived in Taiwan and said that either Taipei, the biggest city there, or some other cities would be cool. And so when I got to Taiwan, I wasn't sure where I would live. The capital is Taipei, which is quite big. That's a few million. And then the other cities were quite a bit smaller, so there probably wouldn't be quite as much going on. But the main thing is that Taipei has quite a different feel from the rest of Taiwan. And I'll explain why. So Taiwan originally wasn't like a big part of China. There was actually no Chinese or Han Chinese people there to begin with. It was considered a place with Aboriginal people related to the Austronesian language group and I guess family group, all the way basically up from like New Zealand all the way up to Taiwan. More or less all the islands in the Southeast Pacific are part of that group. So a few hundred years ago, some Chinese immigrants started coming and farming like on the west coast of Taiwan. And then later the Dutch and then the Spanish came and occupied parts of Taiwan. And then during the Qing dynasty, they got more of control of Taiwan, and it was part of China, I guess you could say, for like a couple hundred years. And then around the 1800s, Japan started growing and pushing into a lot of these areas. They ended up taking over Taiwan from 1895 to 1945. So that's why Taiwan also has a different feel, because you had your old school Chinese who came from Fujian province like over the last few hundred years, the original people, which were the native people who were kind of pushed out of the plains and ended up more into the mountains and the East Coast. And then you had the Japanese take over. So that's why it already has quite a mix of different groups, which makes it have a little bit of a different identity. So when the Japanese lost World War II, it went back to China, and then China was in a civil war for a few years, the communists against the Kuomintang. So the Kuomintang, who was ruling China and Taiwan, lost that war, and so they fled to Taiwan in the late 40s. So that's when Chiang Kai-shek, or he's called Jiang Jieshi, went to Taiwan with many of the relics from China and historical things, and, you know, I guess several million people went there. And so basically that civil war never ended since the late 40s. which is why it's such a big deal today. My next video, I'll talk about, is Taiwan part of China? A little bit more about this, but I don't want to make this whole video about that. So anyway, when Chiang Kai-shek took over, the local people were happy that the Japanese left, but this was still like a foreign group in a way, because those people were mostly speaking like a Fujian language, and the mainland people were speaking more Mandarin and other languages. And so they already had all of the industries were taken over by the Japanese before. They were hoping to share more of that. And of course, that wasn't the case. There was basically some protests around the early 50s or so. And on February 28th, there was like this huge crackdown on all the people that killed thousands of people, if not tens of thousands. I think it was somewhere in the thousands. And it was under martial law until the 1990s. And then eventually Taiwan became a democracy. So that's the short end of it. And so you had the old group, which were the mix of the Aboriginal people and the people from Fujian over the last 100 years around most of Taiwan. But the big group in Taipei would be basically all the new Chinese who fled there, basically, and then ended up in control of the island. So those two groups have more or less disliked each other for several decades. Things now aren't like that, but like back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, they were definitely not friends. So one of the good things about the Kuomintang, or about the party that left China to come to Taiwan, is they kept a lot of the traditions of China, whereas mainland China went communist, and obviously we know communism is usually very against religion and a lot of the traditional cultural aspects. So in Taiwan, you have a lot of, like, for instance, they use the traditional Chinese characters, and there's more religious things around. So, like, even in little shops all around, you'll have, like, a little Buddhist shrine. It really reminded me much more of, like, India. You have many, like, religious things around, little temples here and there. You have that much more in Taiwan. You don't see that really in mainland too much. And even though mainland China and Taiwan celebrate the major holidays, Taiwan still has a lot of little festivals for like the smaller gods and things like that. So even when I moved into my apartment, there was a little temple outside, and just one night when I was having a party, right outside my front door, they had all this kind of drums and fireworks and dancing and mascots and different things. So it's a little bit more interesting in that way, I think. So although Taiwan started modernizing well before mainland China, they still kept a lot of the traditional things. So that's kind of an interesting mix. Their economy like shot up in like the 60s and 70s, and they became one of the Asian tigers. So they've been quite a big economy in that region. Although the last 20, 30 years, as China's grown, it's kind of overshadowed them, and they've been a little bit stagnant in the last 2-3 decades. So as I mentioned, I wasn't sure where I'd live when I first got to Taipei. I figured it might be cool to live like a year in one of the smaller cities and then maybe go back to Taipei. So I got a job and lived out in this place called Xinzhuang, which is in the western part of Taipei. Quite a bit outside the city, like probably about a 35-minute taxi ride. If you were taking the bus to the metro, it could be like an hour downtown. So definitely out of the way. But the rent is quite high right downtown in the center. So like out there, at least I got a 3-bedroom apartment for probably like $400. That way, if I wanted a roommate or I wanted friends or family to come and stay with me, they had an extra room. And I figured I also generally, when I move to a place, I kind of want to meet more of the locals. I don't want to just start going to like bars with other expats and foreigners. I want to kind of learn Chinese, meet some new friends and things like that. So I started teaching and exploring a bit in general. I started organizing trips on the weekend, which was pretty cool. So that was a good way to meet some new people and explore the city. But the problem is that my experience, or at least what I expected Taiwan to be, was basically like where I lived in China, and just kind of a modern version of that. And in many ways it is, but it's also quite different. Like in Kunming, it's like a much more slow pace of life where people take time. There's nothing planned. You just you can meet someone, hang out at a bar, and call them the next day. Hey, what are you doing? And do a language exchange and things like that. Where in Taipei, people are really busy. They're with their family on the weekend or other friends, and they plan things like a week in advance. So it wasn't really like in my neighborhood, I go out to like a bar or really meet too many connections easily. Like people were busy, and so that was a little bit isolating. especially because I had just come off of a bike trip for several years traveling. And so I didn't really want to be in this situation where I felt a little isolated. So if I knew that, I probably wouldn't have did that again. But regardless, at least the next couple years were much better than that first year. Like I said, I started doing bike tours on the weekends. Around that time, Facebook had only been about 2 or 3 years old. And it was good because you could put on an event on Facebook and like anyone in Taipei or Taiwan could see it, whether a foreigner or a local. So I would do trips like every weekend, either mostly biking, some trips hiking, and some other activities like frisbee golf. And then I did a bunch of house parties too that just totally rocked. So it was definitely cool as long as you plan things in advance. If you were to, maybe Friday just had great weather and it's perfect, and you're like, hey, let's do a rooftop barbecue, and you text 20 people, there's no way anyone would even respond. You definitely have to plan things there a few days in advance or a week in advance or something like that. Which wasn't really a big deal, but for whatever reason, at least for me, it was a pet peeve, even until I left. The problem is that I had certain expectations and it didn't meet my expectations, and then I was upset about it, when the reality is definitely never have expectations, or don't have too many, because you really don't know what your experience is going to be like. So don't think this is going to be I'm going to move to this perfect tropical island in the Caribbean, or move to this city in, whether the Balkans or in Colombia or whatever, and say, oh, this is just going to be perfect. No, you have no idea what it's going to be like. So my recommendation is not to have too high of expectations of anywhere, especially if you've never visited there. So during my first year, I'd seen, either through talking to people or looking online, that they had graduate degrees, and some of them were in English. And so I looked and applied, and I found a program that was basically either a Chinese or Taiwan studies. And it was actually called Asia Pacific Studies, but it had a focus on either Taiwan or mainland China. And so I applied to that school and got in. And the other good thing was that I could use my GI Bill at that school and a few other schools there. And so that was great because, to be honest, teaching or working is okay in general, but I think going to school is much better. And at least I had some money from the GI Bill, and plenty of the other students I was with in class from many other countries got scholarships. So I'll show some information later, but that definitely could be a good deal for you. And then I also moved from that place, Xinzhuang, down a little bit more, not in the center of town, but kind of close to the university area near Shida and Gongguan. Has a lot of universities, so that's kind of a cool place to just go down and whether you want to get Western food or local food or go to bars, it's a little geared towards, lower or cheaper budget. Downtown is a little bit more posh and expensive. So that was definitely a good move. I could bike to school in 20 minutes. And so that was definitely really nice. They have a ton of great bike trails throughout Taipei, mostly along the rivers. There's 2 or 3 rivers that kind of intersect in different areas. And so you could just go down these trails for all day basically. One goes all the way up to the north towards Danshui, and that's actually a neat little port because you could even rent a boat for the evening for, I don't know what it is, maybe $20-$30 a person, and you could go out for 2, 3, 4 hours, and you could barbecue and have drinks, and that's kind of a cool thing in the evenings to do. And then you could go all the way down south on some bike paths and then some back roads to a place called Wulai, which is cool. It's an Aboriginal village, and they've got a nice waterfall and a few other cool things to see. And actually, you can keep going past that town, and it gets really remote because it's basically a dead end, and there's some other cool waterfalls and things. So that was one of my favorite spots. A pretty cool spot down in the south of Taipei is Xindian, and that's usually where the metro stopped. I don't know if it continued since then, but from there's some nice, cool areas to hang out on the water. And then that's where you could bike to Wulai in 3 hours or so. And then there's several other cool bike routes through the mountains. Whether you go to the west or up in the north, there's this Beetle hot springs. You could go along the coast, and there's some pretty areas. You've got a lot of nice hiking that's in the mountains with views of the coast that are pretty cool. And another good thing that you don't have in many other countries is that you could bring your bike on many of the metro cars or even the bus, which is really helpful because sometimes you want to bike out to a spot and you don't want to bike all the way back. So you could take off your front wheel and put it in a bag and bring it on the bus or on the metro in certain cars. It was usually either the front or the end. at certain stations. So not every single station, but some of the stations. And there's also tons of hiking just off many of these metro stops. You can go up to Elephant Mountain and get a view of 101. And because the whole city's basically surrounded by jungles and mountains. So there's plenty of areas you can like get off and go hiking. Or you could take a short bus ride or like use a scooter or bike to get out to some other kind of like little touristy towns that are nice, like Shifen, which was basically a place where the railroad goes through, and it's a cute little town, and you could get those Chinese lanterns, and you could like kind of fill out like or paint it differently and then let it into the air, which was kind of cool. You've got a lot of night markets, which I guess is popular in many other countries in Southeast Asia and China. And one of the main specialties there they have is a chow tofu, which is stinky tofu. It's not for everyone. I liked it. I thought it was okay. It kind of reminds me of something like Limburger cheese, which is kind of stinky. And so if you're not into that weird kind of smell, you might not be into it. But I would try some. It's pretty decent. And of course, they have a bunch of other things you can get. The other cultural aspect of Taiwan you see everywhere are the beetle nut stands with beetle nut beauties. And these are stands where they sell this little piece of, I don't know if it's even a fruit or what you'd consider it, called beetle nut. And they wrap it with a leaf and some other things, and you chew on it, and you see people actually keep spitting it out, this red liquid. It's kind of like, almost like having chewing tobacco, basically. And so that's all over Taiwan and in Hainan Island in mainland China and a couple other places in Southeast Asia. I've tried it a bunch of times. I mean, it gives you a pretty strong buzz. It's stronger than coffee and maybe not as strong as cocaine, I guess something like that. You get a buzz for a few minutes, but you'd have to keep eating it all day to get that kind of buzz. So I wasn't too into it, but it could be worth trying. The entire east coast of Taiwan is awesome. I mean, you've only got like 3 major cities or so, which I think the biggest one, Hualien, is only like 250,000. Ilan's probably like, I don't know, 50 or 100,000, and Taidong in the south is like, you know, maybe 30, 40,000, but definitely real small, especially when you compare it in general to like Chinese cities, which are usually like, a small city is like a few million in mainland China. So you've got a few of those cities, and then in between there's just little towns or nothing really. And so it's like actually really remote and really nice. Some of the beaches are nice in sand. Other areas are kind of rocky. Like just small, like they're smooth rocks that are like the size of baseball. So it's still okay to like hang out and stuff, but not like a real nice beach. Nicer beaches are a little further down. And there's some cool little towns. Like I used to hang out once in a while in a place called Dulan. There was a cool hotel there that a Canadian guy made with his Taiwanese wife that was super artistic and kind of neat. And then a few like kind of like bars down there, and that area and many areas too on the East Coast are big with surfing. So if you're into surfing, Taiwan can also be a good option. And then a few places were pretty good for like deep sea diving or snorkeling or whatever. There's a couple islands you could do some of that on. One of them was Lu Dao in Lanyu, which I think are Green Island and Orchid Island. Near Geelong, there's some decent scuba diving and surfing. I know I have a Canadian buddy I knew from when I lived in Taipei, and he opened up a place for scuba diving, and I think they sell like some other food or ice cream. So if you're in Geelong, you could check that out. It's a cool place. The East Coast, about halfway down, you also have one of the biggest tourist attractions, which is Taroko Gorge, which is really pretty. There's just this super narrow scenic gorge that's, I don't know, probably several hundred meters high, and that's a really pretty thing. If you're in that area, you could rent a scooter and go through there, or take a tour or bike or whatever, and that's super pretty. And then all down that East Coast, you can take the coast, or there's some inland roads in the Rift Valley, but either way, it's really pretty. You also have a few good areas for river tracing. You've got some really high mountains there, so there's some cool rivers they could hike up into the gorges and do river tracing. I didn't do too much while I was there, but when I go back, I'd like to check that out. At the very southern tip, you've got Kending, which is a pretty popular beach town area for foreigners and Taiwanese. It's the furthest southern point, so it's warmer most of the year, real hot in summer. But there's a lot of nice beaches there to hang out, and restaurants and bars and stuff. And every year they used to do a thing called Spring Scream for like 4 days. It was a music festival, and people set up tents, and they had many different stands where they had like different bands playing and people partying and stuff. So that was a really fun thing. Before, I think it was a joint enterprise between foreigners and Taiwanese. I think some Taiwanese bought it out, so it kind of lost some of the, I guess you could say, that foreign influence. And I'm not sure if they're doing it anymore because of like the COVID thing, but I imagine it'll probably come back. But definitely a pretty nice spot. Right above that is the third biggest city, which is Kaohsiung. And that's a pretty cool city. I think if I lived in another city, that one would be probably pretty decent. It wouldn't have a real big expat population and a ton to do, but the weather down there is a lot better. Definitely too hot in the summer, but their winters would be better than Taipei. And I don't think they get quite as much rain as Taipei. Taipei at the northern end gets a ton of rain, like much more than London. I mean, it's all year round. You just get slammed with rain. So it's really cloudy a lot, and some people don't like it for that reason. I didn't mind too much. In general, most of the year it was fine. I mean, it got like into the 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter, maybe 40s, but like it never snowed or anything like that. Above Kaohsiung, you've got Tainan, which was actually one of the Dutch outposts for, I don't know, a few decades. And then it was the capital of Taiwan for a couple centuries. And so there's a few historical things to see there. Nothing like super special, but not too bad. And then above there's Taichung, which is the second biggest city in Taiwan. I didn't really spend too much time there. I guess there's some expats. Not like a huge population of expats, but there's some decent spots in the mountains near there. But in general, the whole West Coast is like one big suburban city. So it doesn't really look like, when you go to other cities in, I don't know, maybe Europe or even China, there might be like some different things, but it's kind of just one big sprawling suburb, the whole western part. So I don't think that area is really too special. In the mountains nearby, you've got like Sun Moon Lake and some pretty things. But if you want to go up to the really cool mountains, you just go through the middle of Taiwan, basically. And you've got the highest mountain there, which is, I think, Jade Mountain in Alishan. And the mountains there are actually huge. I mean, considering that Taiwan's small and the sea's not far from the mountains, it goes up to almost 4,000 meters or almost 13,000 feet. If you consider Colorado, the peaks here just go over 14,000 feet. So it's almost as high as Colorado. So there's definitely some great opportunities for like high altitude hiking and all kinds of things in those mountain areas. I recommend either taking a scooter or a motorbike or a bicycle and actually biking or going around Taiwan, going down the East Coast and part of that Rift Valley, and then seeing a little bit of the West Coast. There are a couple pretty things near Kaohsiung or Tainan, and then kind of go back up towards Alishan and through the mountains, and there's some really cool little towns up there. As I mentioned, in Taipei, it's great for biking around the city on those bike routes. But all of Taiwan's actually super bike friendly. Like down on the East Coast, you could actually camp at like any of those police stations. And in any of the 7-Elevens, they've got bike pumps and stuff like this. So it's definitely really bike friendly. They don't have bike trails all of the East Coast, but they definitely do in a few areas. The only sketchy area is between Yilan and Taroko Gorge. That road's really narrow through like a bunch of these, I think it's called the Qingshui Cliffs or something like this, and it's real narrow there. So maybe on that area I would just take a train and start in like Hualien and go down. But other than that, it's quite good. As I mentioned, they have generous scholarships there for foreigners. You could look online at the MOE scholarships, the Ministry of Education. I went to the National Chengchi University down in Mujia, which is basically a suburb in South Taipei. Really nice area. I actually biked around there quite a bit and did frisbee golf out there, so pretty cool area. And they have a few programs in English. And then there's a few other universities in Taiwan which have English programs that you could apply for. And of course, you could also study Chinese there. The process would probably be that you submit to the school and send them your transcripts, and then you'll get a reply, and once you're accepted, then I think you apply for the scholarship. And I'd say a decent amount of people get that. It seemed like a lot of people from Latin America were getting those scholarships and living there for a long time. Because, for instance, people could apply, like study Chinese, and then apply to study their master's and then their PhD, and they could apply for a scholarship every time. And it seemed like if you were approved for the first scholarship, that you were kind of automatically able to use that again for the most part. I mean, I'm sure if you had bad grades, you might not be eligible. But I knew people Taiwan for 10 years. Like, they studied their masters, their bachelors, studied Chinese, were into their PhD, and they were from Colombia or Mexico or wherever. So I would look into those options. I really liked the program I was in. It was in English. We did a bunch of coursework for like a year and a half, and then the last semester was pretty much just writing the thesis. My advisor for my master's was actually an anthropologist that graduated from Berkeley. So it was a few foreign teachers and a bunch of Taiwanese ones, and I thought the discussions in class and the course in general was pretty good. The scholarships don't give you a ton of money, but you don't have to pay for school, and then you get about $750 to like $1,000 a month, which isn't a ton of money, but that's still decent. It would pay your rent and like a little bit of your food at least. And then I think most other people had like, at least a tutoring job or something like that. So now I'll go into the differences between China and Taiwan and what I think is better. So one big difference between mainland China and Taiwan is that Taiwan's been a democracy since the 90s. So they've had free speech for a while now. So in mainland China, like, not only do you not have free speech, but you can't get like Google, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and many other websites. So when you go to mainland China, you have to get a VPN so you can access those kinds of websites, which isn't a super big deal, but it's just kind of annoying. And any time that there's like big government get-togethers in China for like meetings or whatever for a few days, it's tougher to use the VPN, so you're not really guaranteed good service all the time. And of course, like in all my classes for grad school, we could talk about whatever we wanted to. There was no restrictions. So in that aspect, that really does give a different feel, and Taiwan definitely wins out over that one easily. Food-wise, Taiwan is good, but I think I personally like mainland China more. Now, the other coastal areas in mainland China, like when I was in Zhuhai, was okay. Nothing super special. I would say it's similar to Taiwan, but the coast of China is not that amazing for me personally. I like the area in Sichuan, Chengdu, Chongqing, Kunming, and Yunnan, like kind of the spicier, more intense kind of things that were really good. But Taiwan has everything. I mean, you could get the Taiwanese thing, you could get Sichuan food, you get Japanese food, and all international foods anyway. So it was still quite good, but I didn't like it quite as much as mainland. They also use a lot of sesame, which is okay, but not my favorite. And they also have a lot more like sweet things. So you might get like a kind of soup or like a lot of things that have quite a bit of sugar that I'm not super into personally. But needless to say, it's definitely still decent. And the food safety is probably better as well. So I think you're probably eating healthier food there because I'd imagine the regulations in the food industry are a little higher than mainland. As I just mentioned, it's a democracy and the internet's open. And it's also easier for locals to travel more. They're on a small island. So the Taiwan passport can get them to other countries easier than like a mainland Chinese passport. Now, of course, things have changed in the last 10 years, but back in the day, like people from Hong Kong and Taiwan were much easier to like travel around the world and made decent money to be able to do so. And their schools and their media and the internet's open. So this isn't a surprise that, in my opinion, like Taiwanese people were more open-minded and a little bit more worldly and more educated in a lot of ways than mainland China. So in that way, I thought Taiwan was a little better too. Now, I also mentioned I lived in kind of more rural areas of China, which you could probably would be more like the Midwest of the U.S. And so maybe people in the red states in America are also not as open-minded as some places on the coast. And the same could be said in China. Like maybe if I lived in Shanghai or Beijing, it would be pretty close to Taipei, I would imagine. So China wins as far as travel and geography. It's not that Taiwan isn't amazing. For the size that Taiwan is, it packs a lot for its punch. I mean, like I mentioned, it's got these amazing areas on the East Coast. It's got the beaches. It's got the mountains. It's accessible to get to so many cool areas. But China's like, 10 times bigger. So in 3 years, I explored almost all of Taiwan for the most part. I mean, not every hiking trail and stuff, but a good amount. Whereas in China, it took me, another 10 years to see a good amount, and that was still only probably half. So in that way, China's a little better just because of size. Work-wise, mainland China also wins over. Just because it's got a bigger population and a larger country, there's going to be more opportunities. And not just that, the pay in China is quite a bit better. As I mentioned, Taiwan's been in a recession for about 3 decades probably by now. And so if you were to teach English, you're getting $20 to $30 an hour for the most part. Some of those international schools pay quite well. And mainland China can pay, easily $50 or more for most jobs. And you could also get university jobs easy in China. I worked and got fired from half of them, so I should know. But in Taiwan, I applied for some university jobs and I never got them. Even with my master's degree, they specifically wanted something like linguistics or like English literature or a PhD to get a job at a university. So because of that, you're kind of stuck with a lot of they're called bushi bans, which are like after school teaching places, and they're just kind of cram schools. You get a bunch of kids in there, and obviously they don't want to be there. And it was kind of, not very enjoyable. Now, I have done kids just even last year in China, and that wasn't too bad because that was kind of a small school, and there was only a few students in class. Those bushi bans were a little bit more intense and more students. I think most people get burned out from those jobs in a few years, whereas working at universities in China, you could easily work there like 10, 20 years, and it's a pretty cush job. I would say Taiwan was a little better for entertainment. They had quite a lot of like different bands and a few foreigners doing bands. Not like super amazing, definitely not as good as like America or something. China, it's kind of hit or miss. They're not really that much into like an amazing music scene. A lot of things in both countries are like electronic music. As most people know, whether you're in Taiwan or China or even Japan and a lot of those East Asian countries, they study so much that they are not spending too much extra time to like play guitar and stuff like that. So they do have a few cool local bands, but a lot of them were foreign bands coming in or who live there. And it also depends where you live in China. Like maybe where I lived in Kunming and Chengdu, there's only a few bands. Where I'm sure like if you're in Shanghai, then there would be like a good music scene. But like if you're not in like the top few cities in China, like the second tier cities, like maybe like Chengdu or most of the places I live, there wouldn't be too much live music. So they're almost the same. Taipei might have a little bit of an edge though. As far as prices go, they're probably pretty close nowadays. 10 years ago, Taipei was definitely a bit more, at least as far as hotels and housing. Hotels in China are like $20 a night. In Taiwan, the cheaper ones are like $30, so not a big deal there. And the rent in Taipei would generally be, at least $500 for like a 1-bedroom downtown. And in China, I could probably get like a 2-bedroom for that, and maybe even a little cheaper depending on where you live in the city. The food cost is basically the same. The drinking in Taiwan was probably a little bit more too. So overall, China's probably still a little cheaper, but that gap is getting pretty small these days. But overall, even if Taiwan is a little higher in cost, to me it had a much better living standard. Obviously, the freedom of information was a big thing. But to be honest, the whole time I lived in China, I always felt like a foreigner. Because there's weird rules, like you can't just get a hotel anywhere. It has to be like a regulated hotel that's just for foreigners. So like in Taiwan, you could get a hotel anywhere, and there's not like a big difference between a foreigner and a local for things like that. If you want to go to Tibet, you have to be on a guided tour. You cannot go alone. Now in Sichuan, you could kind of go on your own, but there was a lot of restrictions, like you weren't able to go to like some Tibetan temples or monasteries that were in like Sada, in some other cities. So there was kind of always this thing like you were a foreigner. And I remember even coming back from the U.S. back to Taiwan on one of my trips when I lived there, and I remember distinctively feeling like I was going back home. Like I felt like Taiwan could feel like a home, and obviously I was a foreigner, but I didn't feel that. And honestly, in all the years I was in China, which is just over 10 years, I always felt like a foreigner. I always felt like I knew I was just a visitor that whole time. Taiwan in general is more crowded in most of those areas on the West Coast and also in Taipei. In areas like in Shengyi district, like the downtown area, they plan that a little later so that they've got bigger boulevards and it's not quite crammed. But Yonghe and Zhonghe and Xinzhuang and Bangqiao, like a lot of the city is super crowded. Basically what happened is that areas like Taiwan, and even like with Vietnam and a lot of Southeast Asian countries, they really grew fast. So there wasn't a lot of good planning from the government to like make wider lanes and stuff like this. So in Taiwan or Taipei and even in Vietnam and a lot of places, the downtown area is just a million scooters and really crowded in many areas. So that part is definitely a minus. In mainland China, you don't have any scooters anymore for the most part. You could use electric ones on the side lanes, but there's no gas-powered scooters anymore as far as I remember. And there's no motorcycles in general anywhere downtown. So they've got a few of those e-bike scooters on the like bike lane area. But in almost any of the bigger cities in China now, there's no motorcycles. So that's a good thing. I mean, if you are in Taiwan, in Taipei, or any of those cities and you want to get a motorcycle or you want to get a scooter, you could get them and drive anywhere. There's no restrictions where like in China, you could have them in the countryside or outside the third or fourth ring. You're not allowed to go inside. So that's also something to consider. So it's more crowded, but at least you could drive anywhere on a motorbike or a scooter. And that's one of the reasons why China isn't as crowded, is because they saw the growth of many cities like in Taiwan and other Southeast Asian countries, and they were like, wow, we don't want this to be so crowded. So they made the roads and the building planning and everything much more spaced out because they knew that the population's high. They need to make it more spacious. So China's a little better in that way. So as far as safety goes, they're both really safe, but Taiwan probably has a little bit of an edge. Nowadays, it might be pretty even, but 10, 15 years ago, like if you left your phone on a counter in China and went to the bathroom, it would probably be gone. I remember when I taught in 2006 and 2007 in Kunming, I would ask a group of students, let's say there was 10 or 15 students, and I'd say, how many of you have lost like a phone or even two? And I'd add up the number, and I would say, it's been a while, but it was something like almost everyone lost up to about 2 phones and 1 or 2 bicycles at that time. And actually, me and my roommate at that time both did get our bikes stolen. But in Taiwan, I came home in a taxi once, and I left my phone in the car. And it was just one of those crappy Nokia ones. It wasn't even a smartphone. And the next day, the guy actually brought me back the phone. So yeah, Taiwan, super high on the safety scale. I remember another guy who left his like nice camera in a metro station in Taipei, and it was still there when he came back. Another big difference between Taiwan and China is that Taiwanese are much more quiet. So if you've ever been to Japan, it is super quiet. Like if you took a train in like Tokyo or you travel around Japan, they're completely silent. They don't make any noise. They won't even like open up like say they had a bag of chips. Like that would be rude. Or to talk to people on your phone on a train or something. Whereas in mainland China, it's super noisy everywhere for the most part. Now that's also changing. It's gotten better. But there's much more beeping and it's much more noisier in mainland China. Now, as I mentioned, Taiwan was part of Japan from 1895 to 1945. So they have certain aspects of Japanese culture that's kind of ingrained with their culture. And that quiet aspect, I think, is one of those. So in that regard, it's quite good. Although, if you are doing parties or making noise, they're much more likely to call the police in Taiwan than in China, in my opinion, because they're just not used to like parties or loud noises at night. I was pretty lucky with most of my parties. I had some pretty ragers pretty late, but generally speaking, in other areas, I knew if there was noise past 10 o'clock, the cops generally came. I remember even just talking, like at dinner time, it wasn't even late, and we were just talking outside a restaurant, me and a few foreigners, just a regular conversation, and the people upstairs like mentioned something to us, like right in the middle of the day. So yeah, definitely different in that regard. Taiwan's probably a little more friendly. Not just the policies towards the foreigners, like whereas, you know, you could get a hotel anywhere, but the people are definitely a little friendlier in Taiwan. If there's a foreigner that's lost, they'll come up to you and probably speaking English, because especially in Taipei, most of the people speak English. In other places, not as much, but you've got a lot of English-speaking locals that'll help you out and be super friendly. So I'd say in that aspect, it's quite nice. So I'd say it's a little nicer in Taiwan. But that doesn't mean that mainland China is bad either. I mean, Chinese are definitely really friendly, especially in the countryside and stuff like that. But the sentiment towards foreigners since COVID has definitely changed a little bit over the last few years. And even before COVID, I made other videos you could check out living in China for over 10 years. You could see those videos, and I document kind of how it changed over the years. And Taiwan's still friendlier in that regard. And so now the big question is, when is Taiwan going to go back to being part of China? That's a huge discussion. I'll go into this subject more in my next video, but I would say that because of what's happened in Russia and for other reasons, like they definitely want to take it over, and they might be able to, but the economic sanctions might be worse. So I think it's still worth it to go and check it out now. I still think you might have a few years left, and I would definitely see it now before it goes back to mainland China. Because Hong Kong was separate from China for the most part until 1997 when the UK gave it back to mainland China. And now it's a totally different place. So I totally recommend you check it out. Taiwan, even if it's just a semester studying Chinese, apply for a school and a scholarship. It'd be a great place for a semester or two, or even 2-3 years, I think is great. That master's program I did was really cool. So look into these options and check it out before it is lost. Looking back, I probably should have started a bike and hiking business in Taiwan. I ended up doing that a few years later in China, which is much more difficult for doing business. And I already had this big following and stuff, but I just wanted to explore more. So it was cool to go back to mainland China. But from a business perspective, Taiwan could be a lot better. If you're there for 5 years on like a working visa, you could get a permanent resident visa. And then you still have to live there at least 6 months a year, but then you don't have to reapply for visas every year. So that's great. They don't have anything like that in China for the most part. In the last couple of years, they did change a couple rules where you could get this kind of visa, but you've got to be like a highly specialized expat to get this kind of thing. And as far as I've heard, it's still quite rare. Like, I don't know anyone on that actual visa. So in China, you've got to just go every year and get a new visa. In Taiwan, at least in a few years, you get that permanent one. I actually would have stayed 2 more years, but the 2 years I studied does not count towards that 5 years because it all has to be working. So just keep that in mind. And plus, China's just more difficult with other things. Like I got ripped off for $13,000. You can check out a video I've got on that. And they seem much more likely to rip you off in China than Taiwan, in my opinion. At least that's just through what I've heard. I don't know that many people in Taiwan that have had that many horror stories where like 80% of the people I know in mainland China have had like a horror story about doing business, like myself. So anyway, I hope you liked this video. I've got a lot of stuff on China, Taiwan. I did trips biking around the world. I hiked the Appalachian Trail. I commercial fished in Alaska. I was in the Army 4 years. I taught in China a lot of that time and did tours. So I've got a lot of good advice on this channel. So like and subscribe if it's beneficial for you. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.